The Simpson launched a Standard missile at a range of 13 miles.
Joshan's missile, the Harpoon, flew at about Mach 0.7, 0.75. My Standard missile flew at Mach 2.5. So the Standard missile actually got to Joshan before the Harpoon got to Wainwright.
The Joshan was hit and sank in flames. This is a veteran of World War II, MGB-81.
As the name suggests, a motor gunboat's primary armament was guns, and these were actually mainly requisitioned anti-aircraft guns. On the bow was a 40mm 2-pounder pom-pom gun.
It was a fully automatic gun, named after the sound it made firing.
At the stern, you had two Oerlikon 20mm guns in a powered turret. Again, these were anti-aircraft weapons for small ships, but in an anti-shipping role for attacking enemy vessels of a similar size. They were very effective guns that could penetrate armored hulls and armored bridges.
There were also two Lewis machine guns, useful for sweeping the decks of an enemy vessel.
The final bit of armament for a motor gunboat were two depth charges, which could be dropped just ahead of an enemy vessel with the hope of exploding just beneath its keel and maybe breaking the back of the enemy ship.
To take on the Nazi S-boats, the MGB had to match their speed. They did, with a little help from across the pond.
And the power plant, which was the three Packard engines which had come, they were a US-designed engine, so coupled with the hull shape and the light weight, resulted in very, very high speeds.
S-boats were hard to locate and destroy. They operated at night to avoid being attacked by the RAF. To find them, the MGBs would turn the tables and lie in wait for the S-boats close to their many bases along the coast of Europe. When their paths crossed, engines revved and guns blazed.
The battle between S-boats and MGBs was chaotic, to say the least. There was no order of battle, there was no predetermined plan. It would be very brief and it would be utter chaos.
Robert Hitchens, an MGB commander and one of the heroes of the British coastal forces, wrote,
"It is hard to describe the confusion of such an engagement. The brilliant stream of light from tracer crisscrossing like comets in every direction. The nearby ear-splitting crack of our own guns, blending into the more distant gunfire and roar of the engines."
The ethos of these boats was very much a sort of go and get them. The speed gave them opportunity to get into trouble, get out of trouble again. They were the naughty boys of the Channel.
The daring raids of the MGB crews earned them the nickname Spitfires of the Sea, an answer to the dreaded S-boats.
Prior to then, the S-boat had not really encountered anything with the same sort of speed and manoeuvrability, and the motor gunboat was an adversary that could compete with the S-boat on its own terms.
USS Cole's mission would be to enforce sanctions on Iraq introduced after their invasion of Kuwait. After passing through the Suez Canal, the Cole needed to stop to take on fuel on her way to the Gulf. On October 12th, she pulled into the port of Aden in Yemen.
She pulled into Aden that morning and had taken her assigned berth and arranged to have alongside refueling. And it takes time to set that up and to conduct the transfer of fuel.
As the refueling began, small ships moved around Cole. Kirk Lippold was her commanding officer.
When Navy ships pull into port, there's normally a lot of routine harbor activity that's going on. In the case of Aden, there were a number of ships that were anchored out and tied to mooring buoys, but you'll routinely have boats coming out that are supplying all those other ships, taking sailors ashore to go do logistics runs, or they might be coming out themselves, bringing out fresh fruits and vegetables, doing trash runs.
2 barges had already taken waste from USS Cole. Then a third approached. One of the men on board waved to Cole's crew as it pulled alongside. Then suddenly,
at 11:18 a.m., there was a thunderous explosion. You could feel all 505 feet and 8,400 tons of guided missile destroyer suddenly and violently thrust up and to the right.
the suicide bombers had loaded their small barge with over 400 pounds of C4 explosives. The detonation tore a massive hole in the Cole steel hull.
We could literally feel our ship sinking beneath our feet.
Lippold quickly went to inspect the damage.
The level of devastation it's almost incomprehensible. What used to be the deck has now been blown up and into the left side passageway there. And as I look down into what's left of main engine room number 1, the hole in the side of the ship, I can see the sunlight glistening in.
The Americans had not anticipated this kind of attack.
You do have a presumption that by virtue of the fact that this is a United States warship, that it would give pause to anyone who would have any consideration for launching an attack. Part of the problem is that no one was really expecting that such an overt act would occur even if there were tensions in the region.
The terrorist group Al-Qaeda was responsible. The USS Cole was the perfect target to help recruit people to their cause.
For them, American military presence in the Gulf was something that they used in their propaganda machinery for recruiting and for mobilizing their followers. They targeted specifically the US combat ships in the Gulf because that was symbolic. Symbolic in a sense that they're targeting a sophisticated machine that actually symbolizes aggression.
The terrorist attack on Cole killed 17 sailors.
During World War II, submarines were primarily armed with torpedoes, and their purpose was to attack other ships, right, to sink your enemy's vessels. Now you have submarines that are carrying a very powerful weapon aimed at strategic land targets.
You could hit an enemy on a distant continent, cause massive casualties and massive dislocation to an entire state, not just to one army or one ship or one enemy unit. Missiles really changed the nature of warfare itself.
The Regulus became part of the United States' nuclear deterrence policy. A threat devastating enough to keep the Soviets from risking an all-out war. The Regulus missile submarines operated out of Pearl Harbor. Their 70-day patrols were carried out almost entirely underwater and in total secrecy.
The Regulus missile submarines were essentially covering really one major target. They operated off the coast of the Kamchatka Peninsula in Russia. This is the far western Pacific, and this was the site of a major Soviet naval base. And this would have been a place where the Soviets would have been able to launch attacks across the Pacific. So this was considered a really significant target, and the US Navy ensured that there were always 4 Regulus missiles available out on patrol to be prepared to attack that target should it become necessary.
The patrols took the submarines dangerously close to Soviet shores.
Regulus was manually guided, and the submarine needed to stay in radar contact with the missile for the entire duration of its launch. The missile itself had a range of about 500 miles, but the missile's guidance system only had a range of less than half that. They just needed to stay close enough to their target to be able to launch it and make sure it got all the way there. So even though the range of the missile is about 500 miles, the crew of Growler, for instance, was operating usually within 150 miles of the Russian coast and often much, much closer than that.
Once in position, The crews waited for a command to launch a missile. They knew it could come at any moment. In October 1962, it nearly did. U.S. spy planes spotted Soviet nuclear missiles being installed in Cuba. From there, they could reach almost the entire United States. President Kennedy ordered a naval blockade of the island and demanded the Soviets remove the missiles or face retaliation.
Our resolution will call for the prompt dismantling and withdrawal of all offensive weapons in Cuba. Should these offensive military preparations continue, thus increasing the threat to the hemisphere, further action will be justified. I have directed the armed forces to prepare for any eventualities.
In late October 1962, after secret negotiations, the Soviets agreed to remove their missiles from Cuba. The Regulus program ended 2 years later, replaced with the Polaris ballistic missile, which could be launched from a submerged submarine.
Regulus was meant to be a temporary solution, a bit of a stopgap, but it did give the Navy this capability it never had before.
Regulus was a game changer. Missile-armed combat ships were here to stay.
The situation facing the Germans in 1944 was not good. They had a big naval problem and they didn't have the resources to solve that problem, the problem being how to keep the Allies off the shores of Europe.
The Germans had no way to replenish their diminishing navy. They turned to a new type of small, fast craft for help.
If you're truly desperate and things look dark on the horizon, one of the options is to go to essentially sacrificial naval warfare.
Instead of having a vessel fire torpedoes, the vessel was the torpedo. It was called the Linse boat.
They weren't quite suicide craft, but I think you would have needed to be a very, very brave individual or someone who had absolutely no choice in the matter to use one of these things.
The method of attack was fast, furious, and dangerous.
You had the boat with the explosive in and a pilot who would approach a target ship as slowly as possible so that he could remain undetected until the very last minute when he would accelerate to full speed and put his boat on a collision course. He then jumps off and hopes he doesn't drown. At that point, the second boat takes over and, using a shortwave radio control system, attempts to steer the boat packed with explosives that's currently running at high speed into the target. It's not easily achieved.
The idea was to create a guided weapon more accurate and harder to evade than torpedoes, which once fired, traveled in a predictable straight line and left a telltale wake. Mary Rose was built by King Henry VIII, who saw that naval guns were the future.
We often point to it as one of the earliest examples of what we could call a modern cannon-armed warship. It carried a number of heavy pieces, ship smashers, guns that could shoot a ball big enough to go through an enemy hull.
But heavy guns posed a problem. Put them on the top deck, and the ship capsizes. In the 16th century, the French solved it. With an opening in the ship's side under a hinged cover known as a gun port. guns were lower. Capsizing was harder. In 1536, Mary Rose copied the hot trend. The British cut gun ports into her hull and gave her a deadly selection of guns. Henry VIII went to town.
There were 14 different types of gun on the Mary Rose, and these varied not only in size, but in the material, in that some were bronze and some were iron, and also in the size and weight of the shot.
Mary Rose's guns were made in two ways. Either crude iron guns forged by blacksmiths, or more advanced bronze guns cast in one piece. Up to 3 tons of molten metal were poured into molds, creating a solid metal cannon. These state-of-the-art weapons came in varying sizes. The biggest were large ship-smashing cannons that could fire a 70-pound shot. Mary Rose also had smaller, long-barreled guns called culverins that could fire cannonballs over 450 yards. In July 1545, Mary Rose got a chance to test her new weapons in combat.
In 1545, Henry VIII was at war with France, and the French Navy was threatening England with an invasion. So the English fleet was gathered at Portsmouth. When the French sailed into the Solent, Henry and his admirals decided that the best thing to do would be to come out to confront them.
On the morning of July 19th, Henry VIII watched the battle unfold from the ramparts of Southsea Castle. As the flagship, Mary Rose led the fleet toward the French. She opened fire. Then, disaster struck.
The best eyewitness account says that she fired guns from the starboard side and was turning to bring the other guns to bear when she turned too steeply and water entered through the gun ports on the side of the ship of the guns she just fired. She heeled over too much, water entered through the open ports.
The very thing that made her a modern combat ship was her undoing: the portholes for her new guns. With water pouring in, Henry's precious Mary Rose sank. When the ship was found, the gun ports were still open. The frigate was a game changer, the first ship made by computer. In April 1988, for the first time, the FFG-7 class was tested in battle. The USS Simpson was part of a 3-ship surface action group in the Persian Gulf that attacked an Iranian oil platform. The Iranians wanted revenge. They deployed a gunboat named the Joshan, armed with Harpoon missiles.
It's about a 500-pound warhead, and it's a big flying telephone pole besides. It can take out a warship.
The commanding officer of the cruiser USS Wainwright, the lead ship of the action group, ordered the Joshan to stop or be sunk.
At that point, the Joshan locked up the Wainwright on fire control radar. Wainwright fired chaff. Joshan fired a Harpoon missile at the Wainwright, and Wainwright called me and said, "Batteries released."
Jim gave the order to fire. The Simpson launched a Standard missile at a range of 13 miles.
Joshan's missile, the Harpoon, flew at about Mach 0.7, 0.75. My Standard missile flew at Mach 2.5. So the Standard missile actually got to Joshan before the Harpoon got to Wainwright.
The Joshan was hit and sank in flames.
Every system worked exactly as it was supposed to. Every sailor did his job. It was just true professionals doing what they did and doing it flawlessly.